Paul Embery. Welcome back to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
Good to be back.
Well, you are the 99th guest, but you've been on you've been on once before, which was episode 18 back in February of 2024, and we were getting into not only the politics of the day, but we were talking a bit about small c conservatism and the old English left and where there might be some overlap there. So we'll get into all of that in the fullness of time, as well as what else is going on in the state of the nation here in the United Kingdom. But let's initially jump into the state of the party of which you remember, the Labour Party. At time of recording, we are very freshly out of conference season for the Labour Party, and you've had some interesting observations in there, which I'm sure we'll get into. But perhaps we start with the general atmosphere of the party and how you perceived it at the conference, because to set the context for those who aren't British or following politics, we've got a Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, whose ratings are lower than any other Prime Minister since these ratings have been recorded in the period of time he's been in office. We had a conference that, at least from the outside looking in, was very focused on trying to counter the threat from reform. And I think it's fair to say that there were a lot of smears on Farage. The racist, worse than racist, policies are racist, were pulled out by senior figures in the party. And some of the policies were being reheated, I suppose, with a Labour stamp on top of them. And there were some people who thought Keir Starmer delivered the speech of his life. And what was your take on it? How did it feel within the conference centre?
Well, I did visit conference, and I spoke at a fringe meeting, and what I sense is that there is a growing sense of realisation within the party about just how serious the predicament is that we're in. And in fact, it's almost unavoidable. If you weren't conscious of that predicament and the challenges that face the party, then you must have been, frankly, living under a stone for the last 15 months or whatever it is. Labour obviously won a significant victory in July 24 at the general election, but I think it was fairly obvious at the time, and if it wasn't, then it's certainly become obvious since, that victory, that landslide, was actually, as someone called it, a loveless landslide. This was not a 1997 moment. This was not an opposition being swept to power on the basis of very deep wells of support amongst the populace. What I think happened is that people were so angry at the Tories, they felt such bitterness at the Tories, they felt such a sense of betrayal at what the Tories had done or had not done over the previous 14 years, that they were just desperate to get the Tories out. And the nature of our system being what it is, first past the post system, then obviously the only realistic alternative government was the Labour Party. And people decided to opt for Labour as a measure of their hatred, and I don't use that word lightly, of the Conservative Party and their desire to evict them. So it always seemed to me that very quickly Labour needed to consolidate its position. It wasn't going to have a long honeymoon like Tony Blair had in 1997. It needed to move quickly, and it needed to move quickly on the fundamental issues that people cared about in this country. And if you look at 15 months down the line, whatever we are now, if you look at some of those issues, the reality is that Labour has not made anything like the progress that it needed to do in order to consolidate the general election victory. And because of that, it's no great surprise to me that its support has towered away quite quickly, and has towered away quite significantly, both in terms of Sir Keir Starmer's personal ratings and in terms of the party's ratings. If you look at take three issues, which I think are probably the three most important issues in the public consciousness: getting growth into the economy. I mean, Labour made all sorts of promises in opposition about getting growth, turbocharging growth. understanding that people's living standards had fallen quite significantly since the global financial crisis in 2008. We then had the cost of living crisis. People across the country struggling to make ends meet, real wages falling, bills going up, and so on. Growth sluggish for many years. And the truth is, growth is still sluggish. There's been no particular economic growth worth speaking of, certainly not in any meaningful terms. And people know that, and people can see it, and people can feel it in their pockets. Immigration, Labour made, again, all sorts of promises in opposition about smashing the gangs, about understanding, finally, why immigration was a priority for people. The Boris wave, the significant numbers coming in over recent years, in fact, since 2010. And again, nowhere near the progress that's needed on that, particularly with the boats. The image, the spectacle of these boats turning up regularly with mainly undocumented young men arriving on our shores. We don't know the background of these people, many of them being put up in hotels. You can be the most pro-immigration person in the world and believe in a liberal immigration policy, but still understand, at least you should understand, why that regular spectacle makes people feel uncomfortable, because it gives the sense that we just haven't got control of our borders. We don't know who's coming in and out. There's absolutely no proper management or regulation of the system at all. And that hasn't improved. In fact, in some respects, it's got worse. And NHS waiting lists, which went up to record numbers, and since Labour came in, are not much improved upon what they were at the time. You then, I think, look more widely at other issues. You look at the housing crisis, and Labour's, talking a good game about that, but it remains to be seen whether they can tackle it and whether they can tackle it quickly. I think you look at the general atmosphere in the country, in many parts of the country, around economic injustice, concerns over a lack of integration, social disintegration in some cases, and what some people perceive to be increasing lawlessness on our streets and so on. And I think there is a general feeling of unease out there. I think there's a general feeling that we're undeveloping as a country. And I think there's a general feeling that Labour have not done anywhere near enough since it got into power. And people's expectation is that things are not really going to improve anytime soon. So coming back to the conference, I think there is finally within the party, certainly elements of the party, a growing realization that is the picture, that it's not an escapable picture, that short of drastic action quite soon, then we've got serious problems electorally, and we need that drastic action if we're going to have any chance of winning the next election. Reform are at the door. I think that's why Nigel Farage was mentioned so often throughout the Labour conference, because they know and they recognise that reform does now pose a serious threat, particularly in some of those what you might call traditional Labour heartlands. So it's not a good picture. And those of us who have been making the case over a number of years now that Labour had to address some of this stuff, otherwise we were going to lose the working class in significant numbers, as we have done and as we will continue to do. I think some people are slowly, perhaps gradually, admitting that we had a point.
So in the collective we there, I see you and, of course, godfather of Blue Labour, Sir Maurice Glassman, Lord Maurice Glassman, as being the people who were ahead of the curve. Indeed, your book, 2018, was it? Despised? Why the modern left loathes,
2020.
why the modern left loathes the working class, effectively laid out from a lived experience point of view, as well as with data and anecdotal evidence from the local area, just how disastrous on morale it was for the people of Dagenham to watch these mass immigration policies driven by globalization just change the face of the area, and that this was just a disavowal of the core base of Labour voters, and indeed those that the left are there to look after. You and Glassman, as you've written on your Substack, I suppose, starting to feel vindicated. You said you did this fringe event, and for the first time, you didn't really receive any challenge. You weren't treated with suspicion. There wasn't obvious tones of dissent. Whilst polls can't be relied upon, particularly when we're talking about a general election in between 3.5 and 4 years' time, is if we're going the way that we all saw it going with the Conservatives, and we're looking at a Labour being smashed to pieces and a reform potential landslide here, I suppose people, Paul, would ask why the likes of you and Glassman have stuck around the party when they long since deserted people like you and that intellectual foundation. Are you there because one day when it all comes crashing down, if it's not this time, maybe the next time, that people like you and Glassman will be there to rebuild from the rubble? Because I suppose, just to finish that question, is there are other parties, albeit with a much smaller footprint, like William Couston's Social Democratic Party, who ultimately embody quite a lot of the blue Labour ideals which you and Glassman have been pushing all this time and have been seeing suppressed by the Labour top brass. So yes, what's the hope for not just you, I suppose, but the prospects of Labour post the next general election actually rebuilding in the image you and Glassman have become renowned for?
Well, I mean, I would like to hope, and it's probably a bit optimistic. I would like to hope that we don't get into the territory of having to rebuild after a massive defeat. We've been there before as a party, not least in 2019, actually. And if we can avoid that, then we need to desperately try to avoid it. But the reality is that we are heading, I think, for a serious good hiding electorally, unless something happens. I mean, look, I'm a Labour Party member, but I'm also a trade unionist, a proud trade unionist. I understand completely the defects in the Labour Party. I understand why people say, what's the point in being part of it? It doesn't represent people like you, your train of thought, anymore, your ideology anymore. It's become a very different beast, to the vehicle that it was when it was created, and the people it was created to speak for, it no longer speaks for. I understand all of those arguments, but at the same time, I think as a trade unionist and a proud member of the Labour movement, I want to be where the movement is. I want to be where the trade unions are, the professional voice of workers up and down the country. Many of them are affiliated to the Labour Party. They have that link with the Labour Party. They can influence things. They can take the party in a particular direction. Although equally, it has to be said that a lot of trade unions now, I'm afraid to say, don't particularly represent the views of ordinary working class people. But nonetheless, there is that formal link. And the truth is that the Labour Party has, throughout its history, swung, between different sides. It swung from left to right and back again. And, nobody, for example, in 2015, just prior to Corbyn being elected, could have predicted for a second that he was going to be elected and the party would have taken the radical trajectory that it did after he was elected. And there are good people within the party who do try to articulate the kind of views that I articulate, that I think once upon a time were quite mainstream in the party, but are now seen as a bit of a fringe belief. The likes of Blue Labour, who you've touched on, other pressure groups, Labour Future, and so on, the English Labour Network. These are people who have been arguing for as long as me, in some cases, the very things that I've been arguing: the importance of Labour, understanding the small C conservative impulses, the patriotic impulses of its traditional working class voters in, what you might call Britain beyond the M25, provincial Britain, post-industrial Britain, people who have very little affinity with the general kind of radical woke agenda, which I think has infected the party and the wider left now in a serious way and made it almost unrecognisable to many voters. So I live in hope, and I work to try to, in a small way, to try to bring the party back to ground where people in those sorts of communities that I mentioned feel that they're able to vote for it again. I always say that the Labour Party, at its most successful historically, and if it were to be successful again, is a coalition between what I call Hampstead, Hartlepool, and Hackney. deliberate alliteration there. The Hampstead vote, which is the white collar, if you like, the liberal intelligentsia, which have always been around in the party. And that's a good thing, I think, because they do bring a perspective to the party that I think has been influential in the past in a good way. There's absolutely a place for those people in the party. The Hackney constituency, which is, if you like, the young, urban, liberal, cosmopolitan voter, city-based voter. And then the Hampsteads, which is, if you like, the traditional working class, blue-collar constituencies, which, the type of people who Labour ultimately were created to represent. And the problem is that coalition has become seriously unbalanced in recent years, over about the last 30 years, really, whereby the Hampsteads and the Hackneys were prioritised, and the language and the messaging and the policy programme of the party were kind of designed to appeal to those cohorts of voters. And the Hampsteads were just elbowed out. And the Labour Party during that time, senior levels thought, well, these people, the Hartlepool will always vote for us. They've got nowhere else to go. They're working class people. We can pretty much take their vote for granted. But it transpired that they couldn't, because millions of traditional working class voters started to abstain around about, certainly after the turn of the century. And in the first few years of this century. And then some of them started to flock towards UKIP in places like Barking and Dagenham, where I was living at the time. Many of them voted for the BNP. And it was clear that actually Labour was slowly but surely losing the working class vote. I think Brexit was a manifestation of the resentment that was felt by many working class communities at the sense that there was no one really in power in this country who was willing to reflect their views, who was willing to speak for them. And notwithstanding, as I said earlier, that the Labour Party won a landslide last year, very much a loveless landslide. The working class has fallen out of love with the Labour Party for good reason. And unless the Labour Party can rebuild that coalition that I talked about, bringing Hartlepool back into it, and not just concentrating on the Hackneys and the Hampsteads, unless it can do that, then A, I don't think it's got any chance of winning again electorally, and B, it could be argued that Labour had ultimately abandoned its historical mission to speak for those people. So that's the scale of the task confronting Labour, and it's enormous.
It certainly is, and almost to prove your point about having the Labour Party having lost touch with the Hartlepool set, we'll refer to them as shorthand, and prioritising the urban liberal intelligentsia, the graduate set, is that I don't know if you saw these polling data that came out of I can't remember if it was More in Common or something recently, but it had voting intention by education, and state school non-graduates Reform, state school graduates, Labour, but only just, and then private school Labour by a huge amount, which is pretty remarkable, really, that somehow the Labour Party's biggest, supporters are those who are quite antithetical to what the party was set up to look after in the first place. And if we take Keir Starmer's speech, in which he was trying to draw a clear line between what he saw as a commonly decent country, one that is focused on unity and not division, and yet I think was referring to sections of society, and particularly some of the national populist uprisings, I suppose we've seen through Operation Raise the Colours and all the rest of it, as being enemies, knowing our enemies, and that those people who seek to divide us will use the full force of the state against, was the promise. It seems furthermore like he is pushing away that constituency which has been lost, which now are flocking over to Reform. And suppose what last time you and I spoke about how it seems as a crossover here of interests between your small c Conservatives, those who've typically been part of the old English left and the Red Wall and all the rest of it, and I asked whether we could potentially see an electoral pact as we sought to dislodge this regime that has overrun the country for the last 30, 40 years, mass immigration, multiculturalism, and all the rest of it, which is ultimately what the current set of the Labour Party represent. And you said, well, I think when it comes to polling day, probably not. When it comes to ballot box, we'll always be on a separate ticket. I suppose my question to you, Paul, is now looking at how Farage and the Reform team have been sucking in people from the Tories, Labour, Lib Dems, and all the rest of it, is actually, are they the electoral pact at this point to dislodge the regime? I suppose number one is, do you agree? And number two, there's a follow-up question, is who knows whether they'll be a good government, but do you think if they are en route to government, that even if they turn out to be bad, either because of unpreparedness or the scale of the issues that they're facing, that it's almost needed so there can be a root and branch clear out of what has been termed the uni party, Labour and Tories, so they can get their acts together? Thoughts?
Well, I mean, in terms of pacts, if and correct me if I've misunderstood you, but if you were asking about the possibility of an electoral pact between people like me on the left with the views I have and the reforms of this world, whether or not we could work in tandem, then I would say no, because I have some very fundamental differences with reform, and I think that many people of my persuasion on the left, the likes of some of the activists within Blue Labour, for example, would say the same. I mean, there are some things undoubtedly where reform have brought benefits, I think, to our political discourse in this country. They've certainly shaken up the political system in many ways. They have, or are beginning to, I think, shake the mainstream parties from their complacency, and to force them to recognize that actually this kind of hyper-progressive agenda, which has been pursued by our political class and many of our political and local and national institutions for the last 3 decades or so, has alienated huge swathes of the public and caused some really serious divisions and resentment within our society. So in that respect, they've really shaken the kaleidoscope, and that was necessary. It doesn't necessarily mean that I think reform in power will be the answer. My assessment of reform is that they are a party who are populated largely by, certainly in terms of their senior echelons, and I think a significant part of their activist base, not necessarily every voter, but populated by people who believe in a Thatcherite agenda, rolling back the frontiers of the state, handing everything over to the market, letting the market dominate, seeing no real room for government other than as a necessary evil, and that government shouldn't intervene other than where it's strictly necessary to do so, and that the market knows best. And I think that kind of agenda, which is very much a Thatcherite agenda and prevailed in this country in the 1980s, and supporters of it no doubt would say, it was the right thing for Britain at the time, and Margaret Thatcher carried out the changes that this country needed. But if you go to some of those communities, the communities that I've spoken and written about, including in this interview, post-industrial communities who suffered very, very badly because of that agenda, and in some respects are still suffering today. I think it threatened the social fabric of our country in a big way. You look at some of the old mining communities, for example, and what happened to those communities in the wake of the destruction of the mines. So I've got some significant differences with reform, and I wouldn't be somebody to say, well, let's give them a go because the system needs it, notwithstanding, as I say, that there are some decent people involved who, on some things, on immigration, for example, on the prevalence of wokery, the woke dogma throughout many of our institutions, are unquestionably saying the right things. And on things, I mean, you mentioned, for example, Operation Raise the Colours, and Reform are pretty supportive of that initiative. I would like to see Labour be supportive of it, but they are clearly very, very scared about it because they think, as many people in the Labour Party often do, whenever the working class, particularly the white working class, gets organised and starts taking any sort of political action, they think, oh, goodness me, fascism's at the door. This is a real threat to our civilization. We've got to try to keep a lid on it. So you can see on the one hand that they're desperate to try to pretend to people that, they're really patriotic. And you see interviews like Yvette Cooper saying, I think she's got a Union Jack tablecloth and Union Jack plates and, Union Jack hats and night dresses. I'm probably exaggerating a bit there, but you can certainly saw some of that stuff from the interview. And then whenever there is any expression of patriotic sentiment among the white working class, they think, oh God, this is absolutely terrible. And it's, people could see through the hypocrisy because Labour itself, I mean, when I was in Liverpool last week, you couldn't move for national flags. I mean, they were all over the place. And similarly with the Lib Dem conference where, all the delegates were waving the flags inside the hall. And at the same time as they were doing that, they were preaching to the rest of us about how, the raising of these colours, the raising of the flag is potentially divisive and designed to intimidate people. And you think, well, hold on a second. How is it that, 500 of your delegates in the hall can wave the flag and, you can display it all around the conference centre. And we're supposed to just assume there's nothing divisive or intimidatory about that. But the minute people in working class communities, and not exclusively working class communities, actually, stick one on a lamppost, you say, oh, that's terrible. That's designed to intimidate. And it's almost as if they feel that, they are innately good people. And therefore, of course, when they wave the flag, there's no harm in it. But these working class people, when they do it, it could mean something different. If I was advising Keir Starmer, I would say to him simply, look, when it comes to things like raise the flags, do nothing but welcome it. Because the minute you start caveating your position by saying, well, of course I'm patriotic and I love the national flag, but I'm not really sure about this because it could be designed to intimidate, you are reinforcing the perception in people's minds in working class communities that you don't really understand them, that your life is not like theirs, that you don't understand their patriotic sentiment, that you don't understand where the sense of resentment has come from, which is spurring many of them to raise the national flag, not because they're white supremacists, not because they want to intimidate minorities, but simply because as a cohort of people, they have felt for a long time now that they're losing their place in society, that their own culture, if you like, the indigenous culture, the majority culture, call it what you will, is being sidelined consistently and downplayed. And we have this phenomenon of asymmetric multiculturalism, as some have described it, where other cultures are constantly, celebrated and elevated and played up. And that is leading to much of the resentment. And for as long as on things like Operation Raise the Colours, so, when these communities hear politicians qualify their support for Raise the Colours with warnings that it's potentially divisive, they take that message personally because it reinforces the idea in their own minds that these politicians don't understand them. They don't understand the sentiment that is leading them to take part in this kind of initiative. And again, we've got a tin-eared establishment that looks upon working class people and any expression of patriotic sentiment or political organisation as something to be discouraged. That's a message that comes across, and that's why Starmer and Labour need to be really careful about how they comment on that sort of initiative.
Yeah, and what's quite interesting about the flag waving is, besides the attempts to reclaim the flag, as politicians are starting to refer to it as, they do so in a way where they almost wear it as a skin suit or they boil it down to something. So in Labour's case, or the Labour leadership's case, it's down to the Blairite British values of tolerance and diversity and multiculturalism and all the rest of it. With the Lib Dems, it's Ed Davey marching into the Lib Dem conference with a brass band, but almost, which is actually a very English characteristic, to lampoon oneself and all the rest of it. So I don't want to take away from it, but the reality is is that the country is in a pretty serious moment. And so for Labour to think that they can just hand out national flags at a conference and say, wave the flag, whilst telling everyone who doesn't wave it in the right way that you're being divisive, and the Lib Dems can just continue to put out TikTok videos of Ed Davey offering FIFA matches to Starmer or entering a conference in a brass band, it makes a mockery of the whole thing, and they treat the voters with even more contempt, as though people can't actually see what's going on. And the reality is we are a divided country. We have, whether it's by religious lines, because ultimately culture's downstream of religion, if it's down to enclaves of different ethnicities or nationalities clumping together, which you can see on any ONS map. You can see that people live side by side, but more like community by community rather than integrated with one another. You got Labour politicians campaigning in different languages, and clearly not everyone's on board with the message of this liberal metropolitan outlook. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any suggestion that there was wrongdoing or at least neglect by the state of the politicians. And yet, everyone who goes against it is accused of fomenting division. But the reality is the division is already here. And no one seems to be offering a way forward. But they're not going to do that until they accept that there's a division here. And so, what do we need? I don't know. I mean, now I'm really pontificating here, but think about Alfred the Great all that time ago as he's rebuilding England. It was, right, look, the Danes you defeated, we're all for England under one flag. Oh, and by the way, we're going to educate the nation. Here are the things that are most important for you to know. Whilst I'm not suggesting we all just go and read the life of Alfred and build a policy off the back of that, the reality is if we're a divided nation and you're going to keep on preaching about unity, surely you're going to have a plan to get there. You can't just keep on referring to communities and respect for communities and living side by side with mutual tolerance, because in reality, a nation will not function if we continue with the divisions that we have. But I don't know when people are going to accept that they are there without trying to pretend they're not and just say unity, unity, unity.
I think it's ironic, isn't it, that the type of people and politician who are so enthralled to identity politics, when it comes to the identity that arguably matters most to most people, which is national identity, that's an identity that they suddenly think shouldn't bear any expression other than in the most kind of vacuous terms. So for example, you speak about talking about British values, whatever they might be. I think that's generally a phrase that's trotted out by people in power without themselves knowing quite what it means, or the buzzwords of diversity and tolerance. I mean, I often say to people on the left, look, try to explain to me why you're patriotic, why you love your country, without mentioning the word values and tolerance and diversity, and actually. Most of them find it really difficult to do so because it's almost like a nervous tick now. You talk about patriotism; those are the things that you should mention. I mean, I think when it comes to issues like multi-racialism and multiculturalism, I think most people in this country have a fairly settled and fairly common sense view. I think most people have no issue with multiracialism. I think most people in this country understand that it is inherently wrong for people to be treated any less favorably simply because of their skin pigmentation. And that's obviously the right position. Multiculturalism is a very different thing. Clearly, there's a difference between race and culture. When it comes to multiculturalism, and first of all, I think it's important that when we have these discussions, we try and define what it is that we mean, because I think that as some commentators and experts have become to conclude, actually, there are two types of multiculturalism, what some have called hard multiculturalism and soft multiculturalism. I think when it comes to soft multiculturalism, which is essentially the idea that, look, We live in a country where people should have the freedoms and the liberties to be able to go about their business and live the life that they want within the confines of the law, which means, dressing the way that they want, eating the food that they want, worshipping the God that they wish to worship, going to the place of worship that they wish to go to, and so on. And they should have the freedom to do that. And it's not for us to try and stop them from doing that. And I'm all up for that kind of, if you like, soft multiculturalism. But that's not what we've practiced in this country for so long now. What we've practiced is hard multiculturalism, which I think is the active promotion of separateness and difference. Actually saying to people, you are different, and we're going to celebrate the fact that you're different, and we're going to encourage you to try to be as different as you can. And I think that has led to quite a significant amount of disunity within our society and division within our society, that type of hard multiculturalism. And I would like to see us get back to a position where actually when it comes to things like public policy, for example, we look at it through the lens of, does this type of thing encourage national unity, the unity of all peoples within our country, or does it discourage it? We're even in a situation now where, in the eyes of the law, for example, the Equality Act, the religion that has been an absolute centerpiece of our national life for well over 1,000 years, Christianity, is given no more prominence in the law than any other religion. And I don't know many other countries that would be so willing, so consistently, to downplay the majority culture of their own country, the majority religion of their own country, in an effort to be inclusive and tolerant, and to try to make all cultures and all religions equal. I don't know of an elite in any other country that is so willing, so constantly, to trash its own history and its own traditions in a way that consistently alienates millions of people who can trace their roots in the country back for hundreds of years, and all done in an effort to, preach openness and tolerance, and to show how welcoming we are of other countries, of other cultures. The idea that you have to follow that path in order to make people feel welcome, I think, is an absolute myth. I often talk about Japan as an example. Japan is a country that doesn't particularly go in for hard multiculturalism, that defends its own culture quite resolutely, that tries to unify people behind a national identity. But nonetheless, by and large, is a civilized, peaceable country governed by the rule of law, in which visitors are generally made to feel quite welcome. So it gives the lie to the idea that we have to preach this hard multiculturalism in order to be a civilized country. And sooner or later, the people who have preached that mantra, that gospel, are going to have to realize that they have caused significant divisions in our country. And in fact, you can see them playing out on our streets now. We don't really have, in fact, the kind of multicultural country that they like to portray us as. If you go to large parts of the country, you can see that it's still distinctly non-multicultural. And even if you go to those places, some of the kind of towns and cities which we're told are multicultural, in fact, what you've quite often got are pockets of monoculturalism living side by side with each other. You haven't really got multiculturalism in its true sense anyway. So that kind of state-sponsored hard multiculturalism has failed. I think that's undeniable. And it's going to take a heck of a lot to remedy some of the damage that it's done, I think.
And, well, look, I think first and foremost, I'll preface what I'm about to say with, I'm not a demographer, but the demographics are inescapable insofar as, if we accept that peoples have a culture, and so you could talk about a British culture and what that made that distinct to begin with, and we can talk about the liberal inheritance coming out of ultimately the era of toleration, once the Protestants and Catholics stopped persecuting one another, and the religious toleration was brought in by law, and you had that big, long Whiggish settlement which had been under for 350 years. And then we can also say we understand what it means like to go and be in Spain or Italy or all the rest of it. You can see a Chinese culture, Japanese culture, is that when you look at the demographics of our country, and let's just stick with England for the moment, it's certainly the most ethnically diverse. And I think 65% of England is white British. And on the face of it, these things don't want to get into a conversation about race, really. But the reality is, if people are harbingers of a culture, is that if you go 65% of England are white British, and right now live births are 52% of live births are white British, and then you go, all right, but the demographics for England show that lots of people are pretty old at this point. We're not having many babies. Is that even if we bring in soft multiculturalism, is that over time that may well turn into hard multiculturalism or indeed something else once the demographics change, because if diasporas are growing to the point where they are effectively insulated from whatever the host culture is you'd imagine over time, as the demographics change, the politics will change with that. And so can we even be certain that there's even a liberal future remaining, one of tolerance, even if we try to get it back now? So what's quite interesting is the multicultural project, which now people recognize maybe on its last legs, insofar as you've got a host population, if you're just calling it that, that's clearly very unhappy with hard multiculturalism. But 20, 30 years' time, it might not be the host population that's the problem. It might be actually where the intolerance might be coming from, that we're railing against, is actually coming from what is a new majority. And so politics looks divided the further you extrapolate it out on current course. And I suppose as a man who's part of a social democratic movement, insofar as that's what Labour is about, and we talk about having a welfare state as a safety net, is do you think with all of that context, and even in the current context where social solidarity seems to be dissolving somewhat, can social democracy survive with all of these potentially competing factions if we don't find that unity, that integration miracle?
Well, I mean, the old mantra from the left is diversity is our strength, as we know. That is trotted out relentlessly, and it's stated as if it's a fact, a proven fact that is undeniable. In fact, it isn't a proven fact. The reality is that diversity isn't our strength, certainly not at the moment. It's our greatest challenge in some respects. And, study after study shows that the more diverse a society, the harder it is to sustain support for things like, paying your taxes and supporting a welfare state and so on. People need to feel that sense that they have something in common with each other, which I think, separate argument to some degree, which I think is why the European Union, particularly in this country, didn't enjoy the support that its supporters would have liked it to enjoy, simply because the further wide you cast your net, the more you stretch the democratic elasticity in many respects, and the sense that we're all kind of in it together. I think when it comes to the nation state, people quite often feel that they're part of the same kind of single political and economic unit, that there is a common bond that quite often binds people together, and that they feel willing to support the institutions within that state, because they feel that they're supporting ultimately people with whom they have a connection. I have, in terms of the longer term view, I mean, I'm generally quite relaxed about things like demographic change and cultural change, provided it's done in a way that most people feel is something that they can handle, communities can absorb, and it's done in a sensible and regulated way. No serious person would say that the culture of a country should never change, that the demographic of a country should never change. These things do change from time to time. But I think if you look at the history of Britain, probably most countries in Europe, I would guess. Certainly for the years leading up to, I guess you could say, the last kind of 30, 40, 50 years, the change generally when it came to cultural change and demographic change was by and large quite slow, and done at a pace where I think people didn't feel that their sense of place, that their sense of belonging was being violated. I mean, you could actually go back as recently probably as the 1990s. And if you look at immigration in the 1990s, it was generally kind of in the tens of thousands, net immigration, and we'd gone beyond, fortunately, the days of the National Front marching through the streets and intimidating people from minority ethnic backgrounds. And then all of a sudden, we see a significant change into the new century where globalization takes hold and the effects of globalization really start to be felt most acutely in working class communities. We see massive demographic change, including in places like Barking and Dagenham, where I was living, which disorientated people, which bewildered people. You saw massive deindustrialization. So you've got that double whammy of big social and cultural transformation on the one hand and big economic change, not for the better, on the other hand. And suddenly and unsurprisingly, I think millions of people in those working class communities, which suffered most from that phenomenon, felt that their sense of place, their sense of order was being disturbed, their sense of belonging was being violated. And not surprisingly, there has been huge blowback, and that blowback continues and I suspect will deepen. If you do it at a pace and at a scale, change takes place at a pace and at a scale that people are comfortable with, then I think you can introduce change without much public reaction, provided obviously the change isn't seriously damaging. And if you bring in, if you try to overthrow democracy, for example, in a slow way, eventually you're going to get to a point probably where people are going to react to it. But as long as the change is what most people regard as sensible, then if it's done over a slow course, I don't think there's any problem. Which kind of brings me to my point that in 500 or 1,000 years' time, if the demographic in Britain, if people are different to what they are, if their roots are different to what they are, it may even be that our religion is different to what it is. I don't necessarily think that's a problem, provided we get to that point in a way that the majority of the population are comfortable with. Obviously, taking into account the fact that where there are minorities, you need to make sure that they're protected from any sort of discrimination and oppression and so on. But as I say, that's not what's happened in this country over the last 25 years. We have seen fundamental, rapid and far-reaching change, not just in terms of globalization and deindustrialization and demographic change and so on, but also cultural change in terms of what I think are age-old social and cultural norms being overturned at a rapid pace. You touched on before, things that we argued for and views that were mainstream 5 minutes ago are suddenly now regarded as taboo. And I think that kind of thing has made people deeply, deeply uncomfortable, and made many people feel that they don't recognize the country that they were grown up in, that they grew up in. And that is why the reaction, I think, has been so fierce, and that's why I think it's going to continue.
I think you're right, and I think as an addendum to your point about cultural change, demographic change, all the rest of it, is perhaps it would be more accepted if we hadn't learned about the powers of the state or even the job market being arrayed against those who are white British, namely because there's a common acceptance that you must have privilege if you are indeed white and if you are British. And I suppose if you're looking at a 2050 scenario of white British being a minority majority, and the state is already doing what it's doing against the white British, is perhaps once the demographics have changed so much that you've got politicians who have illiberal ideas because they're not being brought up in the liberal culture, or they're a couple of generations down from it, then it's conceivable that illiberal policies continue. And I suppose that's where I think, just to build on your point of these divisions deepening, that's where I think they'll come from, when people just have the perceived injustice that things are being dispossessed, and that seems to be what people are thinking about at the moment. Paul, I appreciate I've kept you on for a long time, so I'm going to jump to my final question. Otherwise, I could keep you on forever. Uh, the question is that I put to all my guests is, what have you changed your mind on during the course of your life? Perhaps it was something you thought was an absolute, maybe it was something more day to day, but it was something that felt right to you, but then it changed. And what was it that made you think differently?
I would say the phenomenon of mass immigration. Prior to, I would say, 2006, while I was living in the London borough of Barking and Dagenham, which, as I said earlier, is where I grew up. And I was pretty much your archetypal young lefty, really, very relaxed about open borders, very much in favour of cosmopolitan liberalism, thought it would be financially and spiritually, culturally enriching for our people, for working class communities. And then all of a sudden, the place where I was living was really caught in the eye of a national storm over a lot of this stuff. And I set out the figures in terms of the drastic change that took place so quickly in Barking and Dagenham. I cite the figures in my book, Despised, about the numbers. And we saw significant demographic and cultural change in that community very, very quickly. It had been a pretty settled and stable community for most of its existence. And then all of a sudden it fractured, and it fractured quickly. Whilst at first I kind of pretty much went along with the idea, well, that's because people are probably a bit nativist, a bit bigoted, a bit reactionary. They're not open as much as they should be. Eventually became clear to me that most of these people actually are decent, tolerant people, but their sense of place and belonging has been violated. It's not unreasonable for people to say, look, this is my community. This is the culture of my community. This is how it's been for a long time. This is how I like it. I know my neighbours. There's good, deep wells of social solidarity and integration here. And if you allow that just to be upended so very, very quickly, which is what happened, then you're going to make me feel unsettled about the change, and you're going to make me feel violated and my community violated. And I got that message, and I got that message eventually. And then I saw 12 BNP councillors elected to the local council because establishment politicians, including on the left, hadn't got that message and had dismissed those people as racists and bigots and so on. Still, in many cases, haven't learnt that message. And I've been arguing for the last 20 years that, unless we realise we've got this wrong, and we start reconciling ourselves to the fact that some of these people had very justified and legitimate concerns, then we can kiss goodbye to their support. And that actually is what happened in many cases.
Without making you stay on too much longer, is interesting that you had the cosmopolitan liberal view, I suppose. I ended up there as well, though I was an early school leaver, so I didn't go through university and any of the traditional sense of an open university degree about 10 years later or something. But I was all online, so even then I didn't get the campus experience and all the rest of it. But when I left my hometown, I definitely had just more normal tact to the centre views, I suppose, as in I took for granted the English culture. And then I started moving around all the big cities, and I found myself in the end, after 7 years in retail and sales, in the beginning of a white collar job. I was actually in a former mining town in Northumberland called Ashington. The only people who had money at this small bank that I was working at as a cashier had payouts from the mines. They had Whitefinger, emphysema. But otherwise, this is a town on its knees. You could see pictures in the pubs of people dressed in tweeds, regardless of class, and looking pretty good. But that was very different to the picture I could see in front of me. And yet, the deeper I got into that white collar work, I ended up in head office, and suddenly I'm surrounded by the professional middle class. And I think I probably embarked on a period of preference falsification in many respects, because it comes from everywhere. It came from the media, it comes from inside work and policy, all the rest of it. And you think, well, that's what it means to be a decent person, to be as accepting of all of these shibboleths that we've been talking about today. And also, in some ways, you kind of turn your back on the town you've left because you go, well, look, I'm learning all this stuff about the real way of the world, and I'm probably right and you're probably wrong. but it wasn't until I had more and more experience of actually living in these cities, and I didn't have a lot of money, I was in low paid jobs, that I realized that actually this isn't the utopia that we've been led to believe. And I think over time, it was my own lived experience that just saw all of these ideals just crumble away, because reality just was hitting me in the face. And so before I knew it, I couldn't really accept any of it. Um, and it's just interesting to know that you also occupied that. Did you kind of occupy that worldview from quite a young age, or did you also matriculate into it through social groups and all the rest of it?
No, I mean, I was always quite political. I'd been a trade unionist since the age of 16. I came from an area that, I mean, the old saying, they didn't count Labour Party votes, they weighed them, in Barking and Dagenham. So I was always kind of on the left. And I think when you're young, you generally are a lot more, radical, because
Mm,
you think pretty much you know it all, and you rail against the system, and you rail against the state, and you rail against establishment thinking. You think it should all be, dismantled, um, and you then eventually, I think, get to realize the things that matter to people. I mean, it's all very well standing on demonstrations and saying, open borders and smash capitalism and all the rest of it. But you need to speak to people, I think, in language that they understand and that's relevant to their lives. And actually, when you go to many working class communities, I think that, and particularly at the moment, I think there's a huge body of people out there who, when it comes to economic issues, I think are fairly left wing. They think that the inequalities in wealth and income between rich and poor in this country are too wide. They want the gap closed. They believe in strong public services. They believe in a government that's willing to intervene on the side of industry. They want to see their communities leveled up and so on. They want to see a
mm,
raise in the minimum wage. They don't like boardroom excesses and fat cats milking the system and so on. But at the same time, they're probably quite right wing on to the right on culture. So they believe in their country. They believe in what some people might deem the faith, family, and flag agenda. Relationships are very important to them. They've got a sense of rootedness, a sense of community. Belonging matters to them. Place matters to them. And if things appear, whether it's rapid economic change or demographic and cultural change, that upends that and violates it very quickly, then actually they don't feel good about it. They feel
mm,
unsettled. And, once upon a time, so to sort of get back to your question, once upon a time, I would have seen that kind of reaction, as I say, as bigoted and nativist and xenophobic and all of the other, barbs that get aimed at those sorts of people. Whereas actually, I think they're basic human instincts
mm.
and instincts felt by many, many decent people. That's the truth of it.
Yeah, true. And cultural belonging, well, we know it matters to people and their health, because we want to extend it to all the groups of people who've arrived with their own cultures. And so we actually recognize that to be true, but we just deny it to people in this part of the world, or at least to only know the culture in this part of the world. Paul, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm sure if people are watching this, they probably already know who you are, because they've been drawn to it because of your name. But for those few who don't, where can they find you? And is there anything that we can expect from you in the works?
Well, I've got my own website, paulemberry.com. It's a Substack, which I make regular posts on, and this will be going up on it at some point, no doubt. And I'm a bit of a talking head. I appear sometimes on GB News and Talk TV and so on. I'm quite prolific on Twitter, as it was, X now. So those are the places that you can generally find me. My book, Despised: Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class, seems to be enjoying a bit of a renaissance. I'm pleased to say, because of what's
Good.
going on in the country at the moment. There's quite a few people have been drawn to it again, and I've been asked to do a follow up, which I may do at some point. But if I do, I'll let you know.
Please do. Please do. Paul, it's been an absolute pleasure. Keep fighting the good fight, and hope to speak again in the future.